Welcome back to another episode of Rock Boys Football. 5 biggest question marks for this Texas A&M program heading into 2024 now. For the Texas A&M fans that have been rocking with the fellas the last couple of weeks and months, you guys know that I'm very excited, optimistic about this program heading into 2024. That being said, there are still some question marks that we want to see Texas A&M answer heading into the 2024 year. And if they do answer these questions, and I truly believe this is one of the more dangerous teams that you see in the SEC. Fired up to get into it. Before we do it, as always, just want to say thank you to you guys, to the Texas A&M fans. You guys continue to just show a ton of love, a ton of support. Can't thank you guys enough. If y'all do enjoy the content, consider subscribing to the channel. Much more importantly, for Texas A&M fans, I would love to hear some of the question marks you guys have surrounding this program heading into 2024. And without further ado, let's get into my number one question, and we're going to start broad. And that is, what does this offense look like in the 2024 season? You bring in Coach Collin Klein, and we've talked extensively about what Coach Klein is going to want to do with this Texas A&M offense. I kind of wonder how it's going to look, right? And you look at one of the probably biggest struggles that Jimbo Fisher had with this Texas A&M program. It really just wasn't modernizing that offense, right? He used the same offense that he used at Florida State with Jameis Winston, and he was just extremely stubborn, and he wasn't able to modify and adapt his offenses to the different personnel he had over the years. I think that's something Coach Collin Klein is really good at. And you look at how he constructed that Kansas State offense around Will Howard. It was a masterclass. It was a reason Kansas State was a top 10 offense in points per game in the country, even though they didn't have nearly the amount of talent that some of the other teams in the Big 12 had. Now you look at Coach Collin Klein coming over to Texas A&M. I think you're going to see a lot of the similarities, right? You're going to see a lot of pre-snap motion. You're going to see a lot of runs to the perimeter, getting these ball carriers out in space. I think some of the question marks that we have is, one, the quarterback run game. Is that going to be a thing with Connor Wigman like it was with Will Howard? I would probably say no, right? You look at Will Howard, that was just part of his game. He wasn't necessarily the most dynamic pocket passer. In order for Will Howard to be a good quarterback at the college level, you had to use his big body and his athleticism. You look at Connor Wigman and say he can do some of the things that Will Howard does from an athletic standpoint, but he's a much sharper pocket passer, has much better arm talent. And so I would be surprised if Coach Collin Klein asked Connor Wigman to run as much as he did with Will Howard and Avery Johnson at Kansas State. What I think you're going to see a little bit more of is the downfield passing attack. And you go back to that Kansas State offense. I mean, Will Howard only took 12% of his throws 20-plus yards down the field. They just didn't ask Will Howard to push the ball down the field that much. I think, one, Will Howard just, quite frankly, was not that good of a thrower. He was a good college quarterback because he could make it happen athletically, but he was not a very dynamic thrower, especially pushing the ball down the field. Connor Wigman is. And I think, secondly, you look at that Kansas State offense and where their playmakers were surrounding Will Howard. They didn't have those elite wide receivers that could work vertically down the field. You look at Texas A&M and say they certainly do, right? Whether it's Noah Thomas, whether it's Cyrus Allen coming from Louisiana Tech, Jade Walker, it's a much more talented wide receiver room that has bodies that, can win in those one-on-one situations, working vertically down the field. So I guess my answer to the what does this offense look like for Texas A&M, I think it's going to be a lot more centered around Connor Wigman in his arm as opposed to using his legs. And that might be a difference that you see from Coach Collin Klein, but the pre-snap motion, the runs to the perimeter with guys like Ruben Owens, I think you're going to see a lot of that in this Texas A&M offense. I think the number 2 question, and probably the biggest question for this Texas A&M team, I've been on record numerous times saying if this offensive line comes together in 2024, this offense can be really stinking good. Now, you look at this offensive line, and why I chose to use the word consistent is because I think the personnel on this Texas A&M offensive line is not bad. You look at some other programs across the country that have offensive line concerns, and you just kind of say the personnel, it ain't that great. They're going to need to figure something out. You look at Texas A&M and say this Texas A&M offensive line has the talent. I think the question is, can they play a little bit more consistent? Now, the things that I kind of rewatching some games, they really need to work on. One, the blitz pickups. I mean, Coach Adazio, I don't know what was going on there, but they couldn't pick up a blitz to save their life. I mean, so many free runners going to Max Johnson or Connor Wigman. You go back to that Miami Hurricanes game, I don't think they picked up a single blitz that whole game. And so can they play together better as a unit? Can that communication be a little bit better along that front five, which for Texas A&M fans, you should be optimistic about, because again, that's not a personnel problem. You have the players that can get it done. You just need to get them coached up so they're picking up blitzes more effectively than they did in 2023. I think the second thing is just more consistent. You look at that Texas A&M offensive line last year, they just never seemed to have 5 offensive linemen play well throughout an entire game. You had good games from Trey Zune, you had good games from Chase Basantis, but you never seemed to have all 5 offensive linemen playing quality football every single game. There was some games, a couple offensive linemen were playing really good and then not so good the next week, and then some were playing good and then not so good the next week. Can you get all 5 offensive linemen consistently playing good football in the SEC? Because again, if you don't have a good offensive line in the SEC, it does not matter how much talent's around that offensive line. If you cannot establish the run, if you cannot pick up blitzes and pass protect, it's going to be really hard to run an offense. And you look at Texas A&M last year, they struggled to run the ball, 3.9 yards per carry. That was 88th in the country, and they struggled in pass protection. It was a bad recipe to have a steady and consistent offense for Texas A&M. And I think it all starts with the offensive line. I think number 3, red zone. This was something that again, it's not necessarily talked about when you dive into the numbers. Texas A&M only scored touchdowns on 58% of their red zone trips. Not going to cut it in the SEC. And especially when you have the goals of Texas A&M. I mean, I've said this team can win 10 games in 2024. You don't win 10 games, by not converting in the red zone. Texas A&M fans know better than anybody else that the margins in the SEC are so small. If you want to win a conference championship, if you want to be one of the better teams in the SEC, you have to do some of those smaller things right. So we can talk about all the big picture things we want. If Texas A&M, wants to put together a special season in the 2024 year, you have to score touchdowns in the red zone. Field goals aren't going to win you an SEC championship game. And you look at Kansas State, Coach Colin Klein, it was a really good red zone offense for the 2 years he was in Manhattan. Can he bring that over to Texas A&M? That's another really intriguing question for Texas A&M. Now, going over to the defensive side of the football, I mean, one of the questions, and it's not a question, it's just how good can this defensive line be? I truly don't know if I'd take a defensive line over what you have with Texas A&M heading into 2024. You have legitimate NFL talent with guys like Shamar Turner, Nick Skirton, Shamar Stewart, Cassius Howell, but you also are really, really deep, right? DJ Hicks, Gabriel Brown-Law-Dindy. These guys are really good football players. And I look at this unit and say it's really good in the front seven, and it's going to be able to get after the passer. My biggest question mark on defense is the secondary. And you go back to the secondary for Texas A&M in 2023, they gave up the big play. And we talk about this all the time on defense. One of the most important metrics is, can you not give up the big plays? You look at all the best college football offenses in the country, they're all predicated on hitting explosive plays. So if you want to be an effective defense against some of the top-end offenses, you cannot give up the explosive plays, especially through the air, that Texas A&M was giving up last year. Now, what you feel really good about is, one, I think Mike Elko is one of the best in the business at developing secondaries. I think number 2, the personnel has been massively overhauled. I don't think there was a team more aggressive in the transfer portal in terms of building a secondary than Texas A&M. I mean, BJ Mays coming from UAB, Des Ricks coming from Bama, Marcus Ratcliffe, San Diego State, Donovan Sanders coming from Cal Poly. I think that kid can play. And so you look at just the raw numbers in the secondary and say it's hard to see this secondary not being at least somewhat good in 2024 because the personnel is too good. You combine that with Mike Elko and the development that he's shown. I feel good about the Texas A&M secondary taking that step. I think the biggest question mark is the communication. I mean, that is, especially in those zone coverage situations, giving off zones, making sure everyone's on the same page. You're going to have multiple new faces starting in this Texas A&M secondary? Can that communication, can that chemistry come together in spring practice and fall camp? Last thing, and arguably the most important, and it has nothing to do with personnel, it's winning culture. I don't think there's a single Texas A&M fan that's going to disagree with the culture at Texas A&M being one of the worst in the country under Jimbo Fisher. You look at the talent that this team had and how consistently it underperformed and how many problems that were in the locker room. And then just the sense that when Texas A&M went into these big games, how many Texas A&M fans were sitting there and saying, I'm confident that we're going to be able to win this one and play good in the big moments. It probably wasn't that many. It definitely didn't establish a ton of confidence with Texas A&M fans with how many times they just didn't show up when it mattered the most. Mike Elko is a winner. He won at Duke. That's one of the hardest places in the Power Five to win football games at, especially in the ACC. He comes to Texas A&M as a winner. He's got a really talented roster. Can he bring that winning culture to Texas A&M? That's a massive question mark. And not just winning culture on the football field, but can he just get that vibe that the Texas A&M locker room is all on the same page? Because again, you go back to last year, that was, I couldn't be farther from the truth. During the last couple of years of Jimbo Fisher, it was an extremely talented roster. We all knew that, but it never seemed to be a football team. It never seemed to be a program. And so can he bring that to Texas A&M? Arguably the biggest question that this Texas A&M team has. I think Texas A&M fans should be fired up about the 2024 season. There are some question marks that we talked about, but if these question marks start figuring itself out, I think this team can be really dangerous in 2024. We'll cut it there. Appreciate you guys rocking with the boys. I would love to hear some question marks that you guys have about this Texas A&M team. Appreciate you guys, and we'll